Everyone's got a story. What's yours? We all live in stories, and we all live on stories. Stories of quests for truth and seeking to right wrongs. Stories of fearsome monsters and facing up to them together. Stories of our lives and stories of this world we live in. Is your story a hopeful story? We think it can be.
Hello and welcome to tonight's event of Story. We are partway through this series of online events exploring our own life stories as well as the bigger stories of life that matter most to us. Over the course of this fortnight, we're considering how these stories fit in with the story of Jesus and what that might mean for us and for the world. I'm Hannah and I'm going to be navigating us through the event this evening. I'm a first-year theologian studying at Newnham, and unfortunately I'm not currently in Cambridge, although I am very much looking forward to getting back to my view of the Newnham Gardens soon. Now, if you've looked at the title for this evening's event, you'll know that we're going to be dealing with some pretty heavy topics. Over the fortnight, we're exploring some of the plots that are most fundamental to the stories we tell, and tonight's plotting question is that of overcoming the monster. Now, what does that mean? Well, I guess from a young age, we read about fairy tale monsters, but they don't disappear as we grow up. Think of Jaws or James Bond, Avengers or Star Wars. We're hooked on plot lines where obstacles are overcome and evil is vanquished. All of us face obstacles or challenges in life. And tonight, we're going to start off hearing from Toby about his experience of grief and loss. We'll think about one of the hardest experiences that we could ever go through. We'll hear from Toby first and then from Pete, our speaker, who'll explore the topic after that. Pete Dray lives in Leeds but works with students all over the country through his job with Christian unions. He loves reading and grappling with these difficult issues, so we're really grateful to have him with us tonight. But first, let me hand over to Alex, who sat down earlier with Toby to hear his story.
Oh, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Toby, for joining us today. We'll come to Cambridge Stats in a moment, but for now, where are you calling from today, Toby?
Hey, Alex, good to be with you. I'm calling in from home. I am based now just on the edge of the Mendips, just south of Bristol, which is where I grew up with my family. Quite close to you, in fact. You're in Bristol at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah, wonderful place. And you're in third year. What do you do?
Yeah, I'm a third year medic, which means I'm not actually studying medicine this year. I'm doing bionatsky, so I'm doing physiology and neuroscience mostly. And I'm at Queen's as well.
And is medicine going to be the path you take?
I think so. I think this year, if anything, has possibly shown me that I don't want to go into anything academic or research. I don't know if you found this similar thing from doing lots of reading this year, but I like to get a bit more hands-on. So I think I'm really looking forward to clinical stuff, and that'll be likely to be where I end up. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. And was medicine was that a childhood dream? Has that been in the pipeline a long time?
I think most people, like lots of people you speak to who do medicine, have this sort of childhood story where they suddenly decided they wanted to do medicine at about age 4, and they always played doctor. But that wasn't true for me. I probably decided that I wanted to study medicine. I was about 14 or 15. I in fact nearly dropped biology A-level before choosing to do medicine. So yeah, I was a bit of a latecomer to it, but yeah.
Oh, could have been disastrous. And yeah, so Toby and I, we knew each other I say we knew each other.
We didn't. Well, you knew me.
A very long time ago when we were young, I remember meeting Toby and playing with him, but that was just evidently much more important to me than to him.
Just to clarify, when we were about age 5, that was when we started to play with each other. This wasn't some recent thing. Yeah, that was quite embarrassing when I first bumped into you at uni again and realized that I had no idea who you were, but you knew who I was. Yeah.
But that was at Sunday school years ago. But at the time, neither of us were Christians. But you're a Christian now, Toby. And yeah, how did you what did you think as a child, and kind of growing up a bit? What was that? What was that for you?
Sure. Yeah, like you say, I grew up going to Sunday school. That's how we met first time before uni. I grew up in a Christian family, so I grew up in a loving family of there are 6 of us. So I have 3 siblings, including 4, including me. And so I grew up going to Sunday school. Knew all the Sunday school answers, but I don't think it actually meant anything for my life. So I was nominally Christian. If you'd asked me, I would have told you that I was a Christian. I knew all the answers to things they asked me in Sunday school. I knew supposedly that Jesus had died for my sins and that I was forgiven through that, but it was very nominal. I didn't pray, I didn't think about it, it didn't affect my life. So yeah, I grew up in this context in which I was sort of told and assumed all these things. I never really questioned them for myself. It was more my parents' faith than my own. So I'd never really properly investigated those as a thinking sort of mature person before. Yeah.
And yeah, okay, so plodding along like that, and I know there was something towards the end of the school that kind of was a big change in your life. Could you tell us a little bit about that and sort of what that was like?
Yeah, sure. So about 3 years ago now, when I was in upper 6th, the beginning of upper 6th, or year 13, my dad passed away very, very suddenly. So my dad had always had this dream that he wanted to sail around the world. And so when he retired, so he retired slightly early in order to do this. So what he did was there's an organization called Clipper, which allows basically amateur sailors, and my dad had dinghy sailed for a long time, but Clipper basically allows amateur sailors to form crews and race around the world on 70-foot yachts. And so this was something Dad had always wanted to do. And so he signed up to be one of the round the world crew, so you can join for legs. So there are 7 legs to go around the world from between different continents. And Dad signed up for the whole trip, so it would have taken him about 10 months. And so he started that race in about August 2017. So he set off from Liverpool and did 3 legs, the first 3 legs of that. And on the 3rd leg, crossing the Southern Ocean between South Africa and Western Australia, there was an incident aboard the yacht that Dad was on, which basically my dad passed away very suddenly in a man overboard incident. So he was changing a sail at the front of the boat, so they'd have to do sail revolutions each time the wind changed or they tacked. And so Dad was at the front of the boat taking down one of those sails when so the Southern Ocean is one of the fiercest seas in the world, and that was the leg that they were on. And when they were taking that sail down, there was a very large wave which pushed Dad overboard, and he was tethered onto the boat by basically a clip and a rope, what they call a tethered man overboard. So he was dragged along beside the boat in the water, sort of dipping in and out of the water for a while, and then while they were trying to get him back on board, and then the clip on his tether sheared, so his clip untethered from the boat, and he was left in the water for 36 minutes, and then when they brought him back on board, they couldn't resuscitate him, which was a bit of a shock for our family. I say a bit of a shock. It was absolutely kind of shattering. So it was a normal Saturday morning when probably heard. So I was at home on my own. Mum, so my other siblings are older than I am, and so they had left home, and Mum was on a weekend away with some girlfriends of hers. So I was home alone, and I got this call from the race director, and I knew something was wrong by the fact that the race director was calling me. And a couple of hours, basically, he couldn't tell me on the first call, but a couple of hours later he called, and I demanded to be told what was going on. And so that was when I found out. Yeah.
I can't even begin to relate and understand, but can you give us a few sort of, what was it like sort of the following days, weeks? How did your family kind of sort of interact and deal with that?
Sure. So how to begin? I suppose the first day was it's all very jumbled in my head. It's a very confusing time, and the things that I remember are very jumbled just because it was such a shock, I think. So after I received that call, I had to break the news to my mum and two of my siblings via the phone. I think my first reaction, actually, before any of this set in, was sort of, I remember telling them down the phone that couldn't possibly have happened, that was just absolutely not on the cards, and there must have been some mistake that they'd made. And obviously, looking back, there was no way they'd made a mistake with that. But I just didn't think that it could have happened. I think I was in absolute denial for the first few minutes and hours, probably. So it was just an absolute shock, to be honest. It felt distant and unreal. I hadn't seen Dad in 3 months anyway. So this is November, and Dad had set off in August, and so I hadn't seen him for 3 months, and it felt like it was happening on the other side of the world, which it was, and it just felt like he'd come home, and this was all some nightmare that would all pass. It took a few days for that to set in, and I think we all sort of seesaw between being shell-shocked and sort of not thinking that had happened, or just being kind of numb and not really feeling very much at all, to being absolutely devastated and in real pain over the next few days or so. I remember going into school, so I think probably quite stupidly, I decided, so I was told on the Saturday and decided to go into school on the Monday, which was probably a bad mistake, looking back. But you just kind of, I don't know, it's your whole sense of reality and what's normal shifts at that point, and you lose sight completely of what's normal and what's not, and what you're expecting to happen. And anyway, it was just an utterly confusing time. But yes, I remember going to school, and everyone else was just continuing as normal. I remember walking into the sixth form centre with a hoodie up, not knowing whether anybody had heard about this. And I was just walking in, and people were yelling and throwing Skittles at each other, as one does in a normal sixth form centre. And everybody was going on around me as if nothing had changed, and as if the world was completely normal. And that was completely in contrast to what we were experiencing, where our whole world had turned upside down. And I suddenly started to question everything that I had assumed was normal. And then the next few months were just a bit of a blur, to be honest, but it's slowly a slow process of pain and healing, but all a bit of a blur, to be honest.
And that sort of, those few months was also the kind of the same time that you were doing your Cambridge application, is that right?
Yeah, it was a pretty weird and busy time. I got told a week after Dad died that I'd got a Cambridge interview, which was amazing news. And then so I had my interview 18 days after Dad passed away. Which is a bit crazy.
A big thing for anyone of any age to go through, let alone someone in those But so lots of people in that kind of situation, or that kind of experience, you'd expect it to kind of like question their faith, sort of how could God let this happen? But for you, it kind of had a slight, a kind of different effect. Can you tell us a bit about what drew you to consider Jesus in that sort of time?
Sure. Yeah, as I said, I kind of just stumbled through the first few days and weeks and months, I think, with like not really knowing what's going on, not really thinking about much at all, other than just sort of being a bit numb and sort of between shocked and in pain. And so my world had turned upside down, and all these big questions started to come to the surface about all these things that I'd taken for granted as a child about sort of what happens after you die, and the whole way that I saw the world. Were suddenly I had a reason to look into that and to question why I believed those things. And one of the main factors of that was my dad, in fact. So I should probably explain. So my dad was a man of really strong Christian faith, and that really impacted the way that he lived and the way that he saw the world. He was calm and peaceful and wise and intelligent and deeply invested in his community and his church. And I don't think you realize what someone's worth, or sort of you kind of gloss over someone's character and take it for granted until you lose them, and then you see all these things that come to the surface. I remember at Dad's memorials, people saying, amazing, massive crowds turning up, and of people who knew him and admired him. And I remember thinking to myself, why it was that Dad's faith had such impact on the way that he lived, and why he drew such admiration as being someone that people felt that they could go to, and why it was, I suppose, that he trusted all these things, that he trusted that there was a God. He trusted that God had a son, Jesus, who had come down and died scandalously for our sake, that we might have peace with God. Ideas that seem pretty far-fetched, and that we could somehow have eternal life through Jesus making peace with God for our sakes. And I suddenly had to question whether this could be true, or why, and had to sort of establish my own worldview, I suppose. All these questions came to the surface. So yeah, I started to read the Bible, just not very well, really, like in a really poor way. I started from the front, which, if you've ever approached the Bible, I don't know, approaching front to back and just doing that without approaching New Testament and Old Testament is not necessarily the best way that I'd have approached it now. And I started to pray very feebly, wondering, like, if there was a God, what sort of that I would know that, and like, just that I'd have some sort of semblance of working out whether what Dad believed was true. And suddenly I realized that the most peaceful times that I had during the day were those times that I spent praying and reading the Bible, amidst all the sort of chaos of things that were going on at that time. And I remember very palpably feeling God's, I didn't know at the time, I think I came to recognize this, very palpably having God's support and presence there. It was this, God was saying to our family, well, if this has to happen, if this kind of suffering is going to happen, then I'm going to make it the best that I can, and make the best of it that I can, and support you through it. We were very supported by friends and family, all through my Cambridge interview process. The college was incredible. We had my dad went to my college, and we had people who showed us around and showed us sort of his old rooms and things when we came for my interview. And God just put people in our path who supported us enormously well, and also worked in us through His Spirit, I think, really strengthening us. I remember feeling that lacking emotion at that time that I could somehow function in interviews when all this was going on. And looking back, I just think God was really blessing us there. And God's sovereignty was very real. And also I came to realize that Christianity really fitted everything that I saw in the world, and could explain that.
I guess you were forced to question death at quite an early stage. And how did sort of a Christian view of death impact your sort of coping those few months?
Sure. Yeah, it was a process. This didn't happen overnight for me to sort of believe that this was true. It was a gradual process of coming to realize that. But once I had that sort of confirmation that those things that I'd taken for granted, that I'd assumed that there was sort of hope of life beyond death, there was hope that that the brokenness that we see in our world, the sins that I've committed, and just the wrong that's been done could be forgiven through Jesus. There was once I realized that you have this hope that's not there before, that the thing that we can't overpower, death, that I had suddenly had to come to terms with, you can have hope in that has been overcome for us in our place. Anybody who says that we can sort of overcome the monster, as this evening's talk is titled, that's a story. It's a fairy tale. It's a type of storyline for a reason, because it's exactly that. Because we can't overcome the monster by ourselves, and Jesus does that in our place. And so it's enormously comforting once you realize that. But it by no means detracts from the immediate pain of it. I think there's a lot of nuance to grief that I don't want to over theologize here or be reductionist to the feeling of grief that people do experience and the suffering that there is in the world. I don't want people to think that this is some sort of insensitive approach to saying that that Christianity solves all. It is not, and that's a deeply painful thing to go through. But it does give you hope, and tangible, real hope throughout that. Yeah, and it just provided peace, I think, that I'll be able to see Dad again.
Yeah, that's a very sort of firm hope and kind of bold claim, I guess, in a way. And I gather you got that from when you started reading the Bible. But what is it that convinced you that what you were finding out wasn't just this kind of big coping mechanism, but was more than that?
Sure. Yeah, I think I mentioned one element, and that it was that I was reading the Bible and starting to pray. But I think the biggest thing that brought me faith, that showed me that the Christian worldview was correct, is the way that Christianity explains everything that I see in the world. And let me explain that. So Christianity explains why we have this beautiful world, why there is so much goodness in the world, why human beings are capable of such amazing things. But we know also that the world is off kilter, that it's good, but it's not perfect by any means. There's this sense of brokenness and being off kilter. We also see that there's good and there's bad, but good always outweighs the bad. And we see that creation, I came to see that there's creation that is created, and Christianity explains why we have order and why there are natural laws, and basically a reason for human beings being the way that we are. I know that we are made in God's image, and I can tell that because of, well, we're moral beings. We have morality. We are loving. We are relational. We're intelligent and powerful and creative, and we're passionate for justice. And there is very little reason for many of those things occurring, evolving without a reason. And that reason I know is because we are made in the image of a God who has these qualities in far greater measure than I could ever dream of. And of course, the problem with it, having a God who is immensely just, I said how humans are passionate for justice, and that comes from having a just God in whose image we're made. But the problem is you then have an entirely just God that we have to stand before. And I talked as well about our world that's so good, but also so off kilter and broken. And we have to stand before him one day and account for that in the face of a God who is wholly good and just. And we just don't have hope to stand in that apart from through Jesus. Yeah, so that was one thing, that Christianity really explains the way the world is in a way that nothing else does. And so after I'd sort of contemplated these things and realized, well, okay, Christianity matches up to that, I then had to explore the historicity of it and sort of whether this could be actually scientifically true and historically true. And so I began to look into that and I didn't expect it to yield much fruit. I expected there to be a lot of sort of vagary about Christ's life and a lot of ambiguity. And I was shocked to discover just how much weight of evidence there is for Jesus' life and backing up of his claims. And that's one thing, if people are listening to this and the authenticity of Jesus' life and the fact that it seems far-fetched, if that's the stumbling block to you in this, if that's what seems unrealistic, I agree with you. It does seem unrealistic from a view that we have of the world today. But please do not please don't dismiss it on the assumption that it's far-fetched. Look into it. If that's what's holding you back, then Christianity can stand up to your scrutiny. You just need to give it the chance to. I beg you at least to give it that chance. Yeah, but so there was the Christian worldview and the historical accuracy of it and the evidence for it. But another thing I touched on was just the personal element of it, that I, in prayer, could draw near to a God that I knew personally knew me, who had walked this earth as Jesus and understood the pain that I was going through. And it's a deeply personal relationship as well. This is not a God who steps back and lets the world spin off on its own. Yeah.
Thanks, that's very helpful. We're probably coming to the end of our time, but thank you very much for sharing all of your story, Toby. But before we do go, are there any final remarks, any closing remarks?
Yeah, sure, I guess so. I think we've had a very short time to discuss a very serious issue that's close to a lot of people's hearts in when I mean grief, and something that has an immense and very real effect on people. And I don't want to trivialize that at all, or tell you that Christianity or having faith solves that. Life as a Christian is not easier. You don't lose the pain of grief. You just have hope through it. And I'd also encourage you to think about why it is that if you're somebody who's facing grief or has done, I'd urge you to ask yourself why it is that we do respond emotionally to grief, why it is that we actually feel upset by the loss of people, why it is that we suffer. From a purely evolutionary perspective, there is no reason to have an emotional consequence to losing someone else. If we're purely evolved to survive and reproduce, there's no reason for us to feel loss in the way that we do. And I think that's God's wake-up call. I think lots of the suffering that we see in the world, I don't want to be reductionist, and I don't want to pretend that this means that I've answered all your questions here, or pretend that I can. But I do think suffering makes us aware of those problems that we hadn't seen before. The problems are there, they're just unrealized. And so for me, grief is a wake-up call. And C.S. Lewis once describes suffering as God's megaphone to raise a deaf world. And I think it is exactly that we see problems that we wouldn't see otherwise without grief and without suffering. So the problem is there, and I would urge you, please, to not leave it too late to ask the important questions of life. I think we live as comfortable, young, healthy, often quite wealthy people in Cambridge who are strong and fit and intelligent, and ultimately blind to the fact that there will come a day when we die, and we don't have a hope for addressing that by ourselves. Dwight Eisenhower once said, what is urgent is rarely important, and what is important is rarely urgent. And I think that really hits the nail on the head, that there are these questions that are so important, but we never see as urgent. And one day they will be urgent. And I think we have to address those now. I'd just urge you to address these questions before they become fully urgent.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me, Alex.
Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked Jesus to help her. So he bent over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. She got up at once and began to wait on them. At sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of sickness, and laying his hands on each one, he healed them. Moreover, demons came out of many people, shouting,
"You are the Son of God!"
But he rebuked them and would not allow them to speak, because they knew he was the Messiah. At daybreak, Jesus went out to a solitary place. The people were looking for him, and when they came to where he was, they tried to keep him from leaving them. But he said,
"I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns also, because that is why I was sent."
A kingdom falls under the increasingly evil and devastating power of a monster who lives far away. Then a hero rises to confront the monster on an apparently futile quest to slay it. The monster demonstrates his power. We fear for the hero, and then at the last moment, when all seems lost and the hero seems doomed to death, the monster is improbably overcome. The world is saved, and the hero returns home victorious. It's the plot of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is the very oldest story known to us today. But of course, it's not just the Epic of Gilgamesh. It's also Beowulf, it's most superhero and James Bond films, it's Jaws, it's Jurassic Park, it's thousands of others. And it's a plot which isn't limited to fiction either. It's implicit in Churchill's "We shall fight them on the beaches" speech. It's there in the Me Too movement, even there in the political rights narrative of taking back control. Perhaps when we reflect on our own hard times, we'll use metaphors that portray just how savage our opponent was. Stories of overcoming the monster, the plotline we're thinking about tonight, which repeats around the world and over time. These stories share a couple of common characteristics. First, the enemy is always an animal. Sometimes it's a literal animal, it's a monster, as in the case of the Epic of Gilgamesh or Jaws. But even if the enemy isn't a literal monster, even if it's a human, it will be animal-like, bestial in character, unpredictable, untamable, a predator. When we hear of these enemies, we instinctively fear that our hero is desperately out of depth, liable to be torn limb from limb. And so that's why, secondly, when victory comes, it always comes by unlikely means. After all, the hero is never physically stronger than the monster. So if the monster's power is going to be broken, it's normally because it's underestimated the hero in some way. Victory is snatched from the jaws of defeat. Why is it that humans keep telling stories about overcoming the monster? Let me share 3 thoughts. Firstly, I think these stories, especially when they're fictional, allow us to voice entities which we normally find unspeakable. Try honestly speaking your fears aloud, and you'll find just how difficult it is. Do you know, if I muster my strength now, I might tell you of my deep fears, of being revealed as an imposter, of being physically paralyzed, or, God forbid, of having to bury my wife and my 2 sons. Do you know, even as I say things to you now, they're so fearful I find them almost impossible to say them out loud. Perhaps it's even harder to give voice to the reality of evil. And here comes a further warning that the next couple of minutes may be hard to hear. Those of us holding a strictly naturalistic worldview might actually find it quite hard to justify the category of objective evil. And yet I take it that most of us will have encountered such sickening situations that we feel only evil does them justice. It's walking around Auschwitz, seeing the piles of hair, the confiscated belongings, evil. It's hearing of a friend's serious childhood neglect and seeing that effect on them, evil. I think even some entities in the so-called natural world have so sickened me that the only category that seems to do them justice is evil. I think we're drawn to overcoming the monster stories because they allow us to express our fears and to articulate our awareness of the world's dark and often unspeakable forces. Secondly, I think these stories reflect our intuition that brute strength is not the world's fiercest power. We've already said that the monster is overcome in a surprising way, and in these stories, the biggest muscles don't always win. Power is found in weakness. We may formally subscribe to the story that nature is red in tooth and claw and that the strong merely eat the weak, but doesn't our resonance with these stories reveal an intuition that there's a deeper pattern still to the universe? Thirdly, and perhaps most obviously, these stories reassure us that, as formidable the foes we face are, they need not have the final say. Order will overtake chaos, light will overtake darkness, justice will overtake inequality. The fated sociologist Peter Dray showed just how deep this intuition goes. Imagine, he says, a child waking up from a bad dream, surrounded by darkness and alone, incredibly scared. The child calls out for their parent. As a dad, I've known this situation many times. And what do you say when you enter the room? You tenderly reassure your child, don't be afraid, everything's all right. Here's the provocative question Dray asks. Is the parent lying in that moment? Doesn't feel like it. But Dray says at the deepest level, we can only answer no to that question if reality is ultimately benign or will end happily. In a video on mental illness, the Queen's College alumnus Stephen Fry likens our mental state to the weather. You may have seen the video. If it's pouring, he says, there's no point in denying reality or shaking your fist at it. It's raining, you're getting wet. And his point is, when we're depressed, our feelings are real and need to be acknowledged. This, I want to say, is absolutely right. Stephen Fry is to be applauded for all the work he's done in making it easier for us to speak about our mental health struggles. But where he goes next is very revealing. See, Fry is adamant that humans, not least those being tormented by mental illness, need hope. And he says that means not just acknowledging the rain, but also believing, in his own words, that the sun will come out tomorrow. As an atheist, that leaves Stephen Fry with a problem. For like Peter Dry's Parent in the Night, it's not obvious where this hope comes from. After all, in the materialistic story, we have biological survival machines clinging to an insignificant rock, hurtling through a meaningless universe towards eternal extinction. You might as well live, Fry quips. One blogger comments, you might as well not, if Fry is correct about the universe. In atheism's story, The monster always wins. Yeah, that feels like a distant reality as we exit a cinema having watched one of these movies, or indeed as we try to comfort a crying child or a friend with mental illness. Humans need hope. Some might call that wish fulfillment or mere platitude. Christianity calls it reality. And that's why in the gospel accounts we see episode after episode of Jesus overcoming monsters right here in human history. Today we're going to look at one such episode drawn from chapter 4 of the Gospel of Luke, the account of Jesus' life we're using during the story. And I'm going to read from verse 38. Jesus left the synagogue and went to the home of Simon. Now, Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and so they asked Jesus to help her. Now, I know a high fever doesn't sound too bad to us today, does it? Living amongst modern medicine and antibiotics. But in Jesus' day, it often indicated the presence of an untreatable infection. If you had a high fever, chances were that death wasn't far away. But here's what happens next. Jesus bent over her and rebuked the fever, and it left her. She got up at once and began to wake on them. Listen to that. Jesus rebukes the fever like a naughty school child, and off it slinks. The woman is restored to health and to dignity, and soon she's offering Jesus hospitality just like she normally would. Now, I know this account leaves us with lots of questions, doesn't it? It's simply reported, no hocus pocus. Jesus just goes in with the apparent authority of God, rebukes the fever, and it leaves. I guess we might think this story must come from an age in which people were conditioned to believe in miracles. What happens next suggests otherwise. At sunset, the people brought to Jesus all who had various kinds of illness. And laying his hands on each one, he healed them. Moreover, demons came out of many people. Now, these people knew that miracles didn't happen every day. They know this isn't ordinary. That's why at sunset, the floodgates open. Jewish Sabbath laws placed restrictions on how far devout Jews could travel on a Saturday. But as soon as the Sabbath is over, they bolt for Jesus. They long for his touch, for ill people, for demon-possessed friends and family. Now again, as we read of demon-possessed people here, we may consider this account very primitive. But Luke, the author of this account, wasn't naive. He himself was a medical doctor. He carefully distinguishes between those whose infirmity is merely physical and those who are suffering on a spiritual dimension. Now, interestingly, even here in the West, there's increasing awareness that physical symptoms can be caused by a range of factors: physical, psychosomatic, social. And that's especially evident in the area of trauma. The Bible isn't surprised by this finding, and its authors add, and some infirmity has a spiritual dimension to it too. Not all of it. Luke makes it clear that some sickness is merely physical, but some is more complex. There's a spiritual aspect to the monster's power, even if its presenting symptoms are physical. Anyway, the ill and the spiritually oppressed are brought to Jesus, and they are given fresh hope as Jesus heals them. None of their stories are developed here, but let's just realize what this would have meant. For them, the nightmare was over. The monster was finally defeated. The sun had come out again because the Slayer had arrived. And yet, don't we have questions about Jesus' healings that remain? Don't we think, even if this did happen, it's all very well for those who received help? But what about those who weren't healed? Even in his time here, Jesus didn't heal everyone. He certainly doesn't heal everyone today. Aren't monsters as evident today as ever? The answer is yes, they are. But that links to what Jesus does next. At daybreak, we're told, Jesus went out to a solitary place. The people were looking for him, and when they came to where he was, they tried to keep him from leaving them. Don't we understand this? Jesus, how can you possibly leave now? There are still sick people to meet. How can you withdraw now of all moments? I want to suggest that Jesus' bizarre behaviour, which on the face of it seems to question his commitment to slaying monsters, actually demonstrates that he will take on the most terrifying monster of all. Here's what he says. I must proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God to the other towns also, because that is why I was sent. Jesus is saying, I'm not going to stay in Capernaum because I've come for a reason. I have a mission. There's something else for me to do. You see, the people wanted Jesus to do the same thing in the same place, healing people in Capernaum. But though Jesus healed people gladly, for him there was always a bigger picture. I need to go to the other towns, he says. His vision is bigger than Capernaum because there are monsters elsewhere. But Jesus' vision is also bigger in a second sense. He needs to proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God. It's a clear hint. Jesus' commitment to taking on monsters is not only bigger than Capernaum, but even bigger than physical well-being. Listen, according to Jesus, the external monsters that trouble us in our day-to-day lives are horrible realities. Compassion moved him to free people from them. But Jesus consistently offers a deeper diagnosis of what's wrong with the world. The universe has been knocked out of kilter, he says, because it's walked out on God. We live in a world characterized by death. And that's God's judgment for spurning him. And furthermore, none of us is an innocent bystander. If we're honest, we recognize there is something monstrous within us too. And so if the world is to be put right, monsters internal to us need to be slain, along with those that are external to us. And so as Jesus goes around healing the afflicted, it was highly significant, but if I might put it like this, it was a bit more like chopping tendrils off Stranger Things mind flayer than killing it outright. Jesus' word was so powerful that diseases and demons fled as he spoke. But Jesus is saying this, to go for the jugular, to bring God's kingdom, it would need more than just my words, more than just brute strength. In fact, like many fictional heroes, Jesus knew that taking on the monster would cost him his life. Only Jesus' life was not lived in the pages of a book, but in the reality of human history. As we've seen, the Bible attests to malignant spiritual powers that set themselves against all beauty, truth, and goodness, and therefore who wage war against the living God and against his Son, Jesus Christ. Now, there is mystery in exactly how these evil forces sit alongside our own human volition. Luke's Gospel tells us, though, that the two combine to crucify Jesus. Jesus' opponents, well, they saw him as a threat to be silenced. And so they were only too happy to betray him as an enemy of the state. There's something undoubtedly evil in their willingness to turn traitor to one whose life had been so deeply characterized by compassion. And the demonic forces were only too happy to fan this destructive evil into flame. And so as Jesus hung on the cross, his enemies celebrated and the spiritual forces sneered at the human embodiment of kindness, silenced, slain. Perhaps they'd conveniently forgotten that Jesus was God in the flesh, that He could have climbed down from his cross at any point. Perhaps they were blind to the fact that what pinned him there was not weakness, but strength. Not impotence, but love. For in the ultimate reversal, Jesus was crushing death to death by means of dying. For in dying, Jesus was taking upon himself the root cause of everything that's wrong with the world. Jesus entered our sufferings. He took our twistedness. He bore our sin. He paid our penalty. He willingly took it upon himself. Jesus suffered hell that day, perishing in the darkness, screaming in agony. And those who were there would have concluded, how senseless, how meaningless, how monstrous. Even the Son of God suffers. But how wrong they were. Because what looked so futile was actually accomplishing cosmic victory, because there Jesus was taking all our fear, all our failure, all of our evil, and dealing it with his death in order to transform our reality into greater glory. Through absorbing the monster's sting, Jesus has found a way of ending the monster without ending us. It all goes to show that love and apparent weakness really are what will undo the evil of the universe. And our own hearts, cursed as they are by evil and brute strength. And there, just outside Capernaum, Jesus is saying, that is the good news I need to proclaim, not just in this village, but in the surrounding towns also. We might think of it this way: if Jesus had just been committed to merely patching things up, he could have set up his stall in Capernaum. But he was always about much more. About raising the world to immortal glory and transforming each of us that we might have a place in it. Such as the sad realities that are caused by monsters, all of them. Illness, mental health, fear, evil, death, are gone forever. That's why Jesus died. We heard from Toby tonight the difference that this hope can make, even in the face of death. Let me say that is no vain hope. Jesus rose from the dead in human space and time. He was seen by multiple witnesses, and his resurrection demonstrates that nothing and no one, not even death, can prevent him from having his way. Before Jesus, every rival power must give way. According to the Christian story, then, we live today in a time in which the monster has received its death blow, and it's as if it thrashes around in its final throes. We live in a world which is very obviously characterized by pain, death, and evil. But hope in Jesus can resource us to persevere in even the most trying of circumstances. We can rest in the compassion of Jesus' character and in his commitment to transforming the universe. He really will return to gather his people and to finish the job. What might this mean for us? Listen, like all of us, naturally speaking, I am a bundle of fears. And the truth is that many of them aren't entirely misplaced, because I know what life is like. In the past few years, my wife and I have experienced multiple miscarriages, a couple of them quite traumatic. I've wept at the funerals of friends whose lives were cut off in their prime. It's not been easy seeing a close friend spiral into anguish, triggered in part by horrible childhood abuse. COVID hasn't been easy for my family. I'm scared by sometimes what I discern in my own heart. And like you, and especially after listening to Toby's story, I'm only too aware that there could be further monsters around the corner. But part of what gives me hope is that none of these realities are ultimate. And because of Jesus, they are all on borrowed time. Jesus has paid our penalty. He has defeated the dark forces. He has delivered them to death. And that means that I can say without cliche that come what may, things really will be all right in the end. The sun really will come out tomorrow. It's moving to hear how Toby knows this. His dad knew it. And because of Jesus' sacrifice paid at the ultimate cost, he invites you to share this future with him too. Now, how will you respond? I would reckon you may have 100 questions off the back of tonight. Part of me hopes that you do. And there are plenty of ways that you can voice those. I'm going to be around in a Zoom call with some others straight after this event. Love to hear your story, to hear your impressions, your questions. There are also some wonderful books and discussion groups that you can be part of beyond story that the Christian Union would love to give you access to. But perhaps the best thing would be to talk to your Christian friend about your feelings. It might be that you want to make a more personal response. As we've seen, Jesus reveals a God who wants to be known, who wants to give us courage as we face the monsters of today, knowing all the while that he has provided the ultimate victory over them. You may still have questions, but feel, do you know what? I know enough. It would take a greater step of faith to walk away from Jesus than to entrust myself to him. If that's you, then why not talk to someone tonight? It could be me in the Zoom call. It could be a Christian friend, and we'll help you to explore how you could entrust your life to Jesus, even tonight. But regardless of where we're at, what I'm going to do now is pray. You may still have a whole number of questions, and yet you might want to echo along this communication to God in your heart. As I pray, I'm simply going to indicate that if God is there, we want to know his help in facing monsters, in our own lives and in the lives of those we love. If you want to make this prayer your own, just echo it along silently in your heart. But let's pray. Lord Jesus, thank you that you entered our monster-scarred world. Thank you for your compassion in engaging the hurting. Thank you that that compassion led you to die on the cross. And thank you for the hope that your death and resurrection offer us all. Help me and those who I love who are currently in pain. Help us all to understand what it might mean to walk these difficult paths, knowing that you are walking alongside us. Amen. Listen, that's all from me tonight. I look forward to seeing you on Monday, when we're going to think about what only stories of tragedy can teach us. And I hope to see some of you in the Zoom call in a few minutes.
We're going to take a moment now to reflect on what we've just heard as we listen to Sarah perform Holding Out for a Hero.
Where have all the good men gone, and where are all the gods? Where's the streetwise Hercules to fight the rising odds? Isn't there a white knight upon a fiery steed? Late at night I toss and I turn and I dream of what I need. I need a hero. And he's gotta be sure, and it's gotta be soon, and he's gotta be larger than life. larger than life. Somewhere after midnight in my wildest fantasy, somewhere just beyond my reach, there's someone reaching back for me, racing on the thunder and rising with the heat. It's gonna take a Superman to sweep me off my feet. I need a hero. I'm holding out for a hero till the end of the night. And he's gotta be strong, and he's gotta be fast, and he's gotta be fresh from the fight. I need a hero. I'm holding out for a hero till the morning light. And he's gotta be sure, and it's gotta be soon, and he's gotta be larger than life. I need a hero. Up where the mountains meet the heavens above, up where the lightning splits the sea, I could swear there's someone somewhere watching me. Through the wind and the chill and the rain and the storm and the flood, I could feel his approach like a fire in my blood. I need a hero. I'm holding out for a hero till the end of the night. And he's gotta be strong, and he's gotta be fast, and he's gotta be fresh from the fight. I need a hero. I'm holding out for a hero till the morning light. And he's gotta be sure, and he's gotta be soon, and he's gotta be larger than life. I need a hero.
Thanks, Sarah, and thank you all for joining me this evening. If something said tonight has got you thinking and you'd like to reflect a bit more or maybe ask some questions, we have a Zoom call happening right now as we finish off here. Pete, our speaker this evening, is going to be there along with some Cambridge students, and they'd love to chat with you. So if you want to head over to that, the link is in the bio for this event. Or maybe you could get in touch with a Christian friend, especially if they invited you to the event this evening. I'm sure they would love to chat with you. You could ask them what difference knowing Jesus has made to their lives in moments of grief and loss. And finally, our next event for Story is happening this Saturday, the 13th at 8 p.m. on A Story for Everyone. Is faith oppressive or liberating? And that information is available on our website, storycambridge.uk, as well as tonight's talk if you want to rewatch it at a later time. So thank you again for joining us tonight. We hope you found it a helpful time. So good night, and hopefully see you again soon.